In the sweltering depths of Quảng Ngãi Province, a Marine scout sniper was about to become the hunted. A routine reconnaissance turned deadly when a hidden Viet Cong marksman, the Phantom of the Jungle, set his sights on an unsuspecting target. Sergeant Michael Mick Riley wasn't just another Marine with a rifle. For 8 years, he had served as a scout sniper, a ghost in the brush, trained to stalk, observe, and kill without being seen. His tally of confirmed kills was whispered among his peers, but numbers never mattered to him, only the hunt. When the Phantom zeroed in, he had no idea he was aiming at an equal. Mick read the jungle like a second language, sensed the unseen presence before the first shot cracked through the humid air. Instead of retreating, he calculated, adapted, turning the sniper's own tactics against him in a deadly game of patience and precision. What began as a mission to eliminate a threat would become a duel between two ghosts of war. The jungle itself would bear witness as hunter and hunted blurred into one. Neither the valley nor those who survived it would ever forget the battle between two unseen warriors, each the nightmare of the other. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The jungle breathed. Sergeant Michael Mick Riley felt it in the way the humid air pressed against his skin, in the subtle shifts of foliage that had nothing to do with wind. Quảng Ngãi Province in July was a living, breathing entity, one that seemed determined to swallow him whole. "I'm telling you, Mick, there's no way the Cubs make it this year," Doc whispered, his voice barely audible above the cacophony of insects. "Not with the Cardinals' pitching lineup." Corporal Jack Doc Sutherland moved like a ghost beside him, his lanky frame somehow navigating the dense undergrowth without disturbing a single leaf. 5 years as a medic before becoming Mick's spotter had given Doc hands steady enough to thread a needle in a hurricane, and a gallows humor that never seemed to quit. Mick didn't respond. His focus remained on the terrain ahead, scanning for any sign of disturbance, any hint of human presence. The Phantom had claimed 16 American lives in the past 3 months, 16 men who'd never see home again because a single bullet found them when they least expected it. "Command's intel puts him operating somewhere in this sector," Mick finally said, his voice a low rumble. "We set up here and start mapping likely positions at first light." They'd been inserted 10 clicks from the nearest American position, deep in territory that belonged more to the Viet Cong than to any map drawn by Pentagon strategists. 2 men, alone, hunting a ghost. "Home sweet home," Doc muttered, settling his pack against the base of a massive banyan tree. "You think he's real, this Phantom? Or just another boogeyman to keep the new guys on their toes?" Mick unrolled a waterproof mat and began assembling his M40 rifle with methodical precision. Each piece fit together with satisfying clicks that had become as familiar as the sound of his own breathing. "Command wouldn't waste our time if it was just a ghost story," he replied, though part of him wondered. Rumors spread like wildfire in country. The Viet Cong had a way of becoming larger than life in the telling, until you saw one in your sights and realized they bled just like anyone else. Just like anyone else. The thought lingered as he cinched the ghillie suit tighter around his wrists. How many had he watched fall through his scope? 23 confirmed. Probably a dozen more he couldn't verify. Each one somebody's son, maybe somebody's father. Each one a life ended with the gentle pressure of his finger. "Earth to Mick," Doc said, waving a hand in front of his face. "You going somewhere I can't follow again?" Mick blinked. "Just thinking about the approach. There's high ground 2 clicks east might give us a better vantage." A lie. Doc knew it was a lie, but he had the good sense not to press. "You got that 1,000-yard stare again," Doc said instead, pulling out a small metal tin of coffee grounds. "Bad for business in our line of work. We're supposed to be looking outward, remember?" Mick nodded, grateful for the change in subject. "Just set up the spotting scope. We've got about an hour before we lose the light completely." 300 meters away, hidden in the upper branches of a strangler fig, Nguyen Minh watched the Yais, Americans, through the scope of his Mosin Nagant rifle. His breathing was so slow and controlled that the leaves around him barely stirred. He had picked up their trail 4 hours earlier. The subtle compression of soil, a broken spiderweb across the path, the momentary silence of birds as they passed. The shorter one moved with the careful precision of a hunter. A worthy adversary, perhaps. Finally, Min adjusted his position slightly, the movement imperceptible to anyone watching. His finger rested alongside the trigger guard, not on the trigger itself. Not yet. Patience had kept him alive for 3 years in this war. Patience and the understanding that sometimes the best kill was the one you waited days to make. The Americans were setting up a position. His position. The irony almost made him smile. Almost. Through his scope, he could see the shorter American assembling his rifle. A sniper, then. Sent to hunt him. The Americans had finally taken notice of his work. Pride and caution warred within him. Pride that he had become enough of a threat to warrant specialists. Caution because this changed everything. Lieutenant Thao would want him to eliminate the threat immediately. Simple. Clean. But something held his finger from the trigger. Professional curiosity, perhaps. Or maybe just the desire to match skills against someone who might understand. The solitary path Min walked. The American looked up suddenly, scanning the tree line. For a moment, Min felt as though the man was looking directly at him, despite the impossible distance and his perfect concealment. Then the moment passed and the American returned to his preparations. Min settled deeper into his position. He would watch through the night, learn their patterns, their weaknesses. The shot would come, but not yet. The hunt had just begun. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Night fell like a shroud over the jungle. Doc had finally stopped talking and dozed fitfully beside their small pack, his hand never far from his sidearm. The moon, nearly full, cast silver patterns through the canopy overhead, transforming the jungle into a world of shifting shadows. Mick sat with his back against the broad trunk of the banyan, his rifle across his lap. Sleep would come in short bursts throughout the night, never more than 20 minutes at a stretch. The habits of survival were too deeply ingrained to allow for anything more. His thoughts drifted homeward as they often did in these quiet moments. Angela would be putting Mikey to bed about now, reading him stories about places that had never seen war. The image of his son's face was becoming harder to recall with perfect clarity. 2 years was a long time in a child's life. Sometimes, Mick wondered if Mikey would even recognize him when he finally made it home. If he made it home. The thought surfaced unbidden, and Mick pushed it away. Doubt was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not here, not now. Yet something felt wrong tonight. The jungle was too quiet, the air too still. The hairs at the nape of his neck prickled with a sensation he'd learned never to ignore, the feeling of being watched. Slowly, carefully, Mick shifted his position, scanning the darkness around their small camp. Nothing moved. Nothing seemed out of place. But the feeling persisted, a subtle wrongness that tugged at the edges of his consciousness. "You feel it too, don't you?" Doc whispered suddenly, his eyes open and alert despite his apparently restful position. Mick nodded once. "Something's off." "Want to move?" Mick considered it, then shook his head. "Too dark. We'd make too much noise. Besides..." He left the thought unfinished, but Doc understood. "Besides, if someone's watching us, they already know exactly where we are." "First light," Mick said finally. "We move at first light and find higher ground." Doc nodded and closed his eyes again, though Mick knew he wasn't sleeping, just conserving energy for what might come. Mick returned his attention to the darkness. Beyond their small clearing, fighting the growing certainty that somewhere out there, hidden in the jungle that seemed to breathe with malevolent life, someone, or something, was watching him through a rifle scope of their own. The hunt had begun, but Mick couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that he wasn't the hunter. He was the prey. First light came with the texture of a fever dream, gray, and hazy, punctuated by the distant calls of birds Mick couldn't name. Dew clung to everything, transforming their ghillie suits into glistening, alien forms as they moved through the undergrowth. 2 clicks east, Mick whispered, pointing toward a low ridge barely visible through the dense foliage. High ground, better sight lines. Doc nodded, his usual morning chatter conspicuously absent. The strange, watchful silence of the night had affected him too. They moved with deliberate care, each step placed with precision, but Mick couldn't shake the sensation that they were making too much noise, leaving too clear a trail. Amateur mistakes. The kind of mistakes that got men killed. "You're thinking too much," Doc said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was barely audible, over the cacophony of insects that had begun their daily chorus. "I can hear the gears grinding from here." Mick didn't respond immediately, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain ahead. "Something doesn't feel right," he finally admitted. "Been in country too long to ignore that feeling." "The phantom got in your head already?" Doc asked, his attempt at humor falling flat between them. "We haven't even seen a trace of the guy." "That's what worries me," Mick thought but didn't say. Instead, he signaled for silence as they approached a small clearing, dropping to a crouch at its edge. The clearing stretched about 30 meters across, a rare break in the jungle's suffocating embrace. On the other side, the ridge they were aiming for rose gently, offering the elevated position Mick wanted. But crossing that open ground, even in the dim light of early morning, felt wrong. Exposed. Vulnerable. "We go around," he decided, already moving to skirt the clearing's edge. "That'll add an hour," Doc protested, but fell in line behind him anyway. "Better an hour late than dead on time," Mick muttered. The phrase had been one of his training instructor's favorites back at Camp Pendleton. Staff Sergeant Collins, dead now like so many others, shot through the throat while taking a piss during a night patrol near Quezon. The memory came unbidden, and with it, the image of Collins' wide, surprised eyes as he tried to stem the impossible flow of blood with his hands. Mick pushed the image away. Stay present. Stay alive. From his new position atop the ridge, Min observed the Americans' cautious approach with grudging respect. The shorter one, the sniper, had good instincts, better than most. He'd anticipated their movement toward higher ground. It's what he would have done. The ridge offered superior visibility and multiple escape routes, tactically sound if somewhat obvious. But the Americans' decision to avoid the clearing showed a level of caution Min hadn't expected. This wouldn't be an easy kill. Min shifted slightly, easing the stiffness in his legs. He'd been in position since before dawn, having moved silently through the night to maintain his advantage. The Americans were good, but they still moved like outsiders in this jungle. This was his home now, had been for 3 years. Every route, every shadow was both weapon and shield to him. As he watched them through his scope, memories surfaced like corpses after a monsoon, unbidden and unwelcome. His village near Hue, the sound of American planes, the earth-shaking concussion of bombs, finding his parents' bodies in the rubble of their home, his mother still clutching his little sister's broken form. The rage that had driven him then had crystallized into something colder, more focused, a purpose that transcended emotion, even as it was born from it. Each American life he took was an offering to ghosts who would never rest. Each kill a small measure of justice in a war that recognized none. Yet sometimes, in the long, silent hours between heartbeats, Min wondered what his father, who had taught him to hunt with such reverence for life, would think of what his son had become. A harvester of men's souls, a phantom in the shadows. The Americans were moving again, working their way along the base of the ridge rather than climbing directly up its face. Smart. The direct approach would have left them silhouetted against the skyline. Min adjusted his position accordingly, careful not to disturb the elaborate camouflage of branches and leaves that had taken him an hour to construct. Patience. Always patience. The Americans would make a mistake eventually. They always did. By mid-morning, the heat had become a living entity, pressing down with malevolent weight. Mick's uniform was soaked through with sweat, his movements growing more deliberate as fatigue settled into his muscles. They'd reached the ridge but found the ideal observation point already occupied by a massive hornet's nest. Another delay. Another adaptation. "I ever tell you why I became a corpsman?" Doc asked as they set up their new position 300 meters south of their original target. The question seemed casual, but Mick recognized it for what it was, an attempt to break the oppressive silence that had grown between them. "Something about a girl," Mick replied, carefully arranging branches to conceal their position. "Nurse? Right?" Doc chuckled softly. "Nancy Winters. Most beautiful thing on two legs I'd ever seen. Worked at Chicago Memorial. Thought if I got medical training I'd impress her enough for a date. Did it work? Never found out. Enlisted before I got the chance to ask her." Doc's smile faded slightly. "Funny how life works out. Joined to impress a girl, stayed because I couldn't stand watching more friends die without trying to help." Mick nodded, understanding the unspoken weight behind the words. Everyone had their reasons for being here. Their stories. Their ghosts. "What about you?" Doc asked. "You never talk about why you became a sniper." Mick was silent for a long moment, his hands continuing their mechanical work. "Was good at it," he finally said. "Qualified expert first time on the range. Staff sergeant said I had the temperament." "The temperament," Doc repeated, his tone making it clear he was waiting for more. Mick sighed, settling the spotting scope into position before answering. "Still, patience, ability to disconnect." He paused, searching for words that wouldn't come easily. "Ability to look at a man's face through a scope and see a target, not a person." The admission hung between them, heavier than the humid air. "That's still true?" Doc asked quietly. Mick didn't answer. Instead, he raised his binoculars and began systematically scanning the surrounding jungle. The conversation was over, but the question lingered, echoing in the spaces between his thoughts. Was it still true? Or was each face he saw through his scope becoming harder to forget? 23 confirmed. Each one somebody's son. Each one a life ended with the gentle pressure of his finger. The weight of that number seemed to press down on him harder than the jungle heat. By late afternoon, a stillness had settled over the jungle that had nothing to do with peace. The birds had gone quiet. Even the constant chorus of insects had diminished to an occasional, half-hearted buzz. Mick felt the change like a physical pressure against his skin. "Storm coming," Docky murmured, glancing at the patches of sky visible through the canopy. Dark clouds were gathering, pregnant with the promise of rain. "Gonna be a bad one." Mick nodded absently, his attention focused on the valley below. Something had changed. Some subtle shift in the landscape that he couldn't quite identify but could feel with the same certainty he felt his own heartbeat. He swept his binoculars across the tree line for the 100th time, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of wrongness. Nothing. But the feeling persisted, a cold certainty blooming in his gut. "He's here," Mick whispered, so softly that Doc had to lean closer to hear. "The Phantom? You see something?" Mick shook his head slowly. "Don't see him. Feel him." Doc's skeptical expression would have been comical in any other situation. "You're a sniper, Mick, not a psychic. Call it instinct then." Mick continued scanning, his movements more deliberate now, more focused. "He's watching us. Right now." He couldn't explain the certainty, couldn't articulate the subtle signs his subconscious had pieced together. A shift in the wind that didn't disturb the leaves quite right, a shadow that seemed slightly darker than it should be, the prickling sensation at the base of his skull that had been his constant companion since they'd entered this valley. Doc sighed but raised his own binoculars, sweeping the opposite quarter of jungle. "So what's the play? We can't shoot what we can't see." "We changed the game," Mick replied, lowering his binoculars and turning to his pack. "Tonight we stop being the prey." The first fat drops of rain hit the canopy as darkness fell. quickly becoming a torrential downpour that transformed the jungle into a world of shadow and sound. Water cascaded from leaves, dripped from branches, pooled in boot prints and turned the ground to treacherous mud. Min remained motionless despite the discomfort, protected somewhat by the small shelter of branches he'd constructed above his position. The Americans had been stationary for hours, their position well chosen and carefully concealed, but not concealed enough. Not from him. The sniper was good. Better than good. Twice during the afternoon, Min had felt the man's gaze pass over his position, lingering for just a heartbeat too long before moving on, not seeing but sensing, like recognizing, like. It had been tempting to take the shot. The American's head had been framed perfectly in his crosshairs several times throughout the day. But something held him back. Professional respect, perhaps. Or maybe just the desire to study an adversary worthy of his skills. Lieutenant Thao would not approve of such sentimentality. "The only good American is a dead one," she had told him more than once, her voice hard with the same hatred that had once burned so brightly in his own heart. "They understand only force, feel only pain, remember what they did to your family." As if he could forget. As if the memories didn't visit him nightly, transformed into dreams where his sister's broken body asked why he hadn't been there to save her. A sudden movement below caught his attention. Through the curtain of rain, he could make out a dark shape moving away from the American's position, a single figure moving with the careful precision that marked the sniper. Min frowned. Where was the spotter? They had been inseparable all day. He adjusted his scope, trying to locate the second American, but the rain and growing darkness made it impossible to be certain. The sniper was moving down the ridge away from their established position. A reconnaissance patrol? Or something else? Min hesitated, caught between maintaining his superior position and following his quarry. The sniper was moving with purpose, clearly headed somewhere specific, if Min lost him in the darkness and rain. Decision made, he began breaking down his position with practiced efficiency. The rain would cover the sound of his movement, and the American's night vision would be as compromised as his own. He would maintain his advantage. The hunt continued. Mick moved through the darkness like a ghost, each step placed with deliberate care despite the rain that plastered his ghillie suit to his body and threatened to turn every slope into a treacherous slide. The M40 was secured across his back, leaving his hands free to navigate the difficult terrain. The rain was both blessing and curse. It masked the sound of his movement but reduced visibility to almost nothing. Mick relied on the mental map he'd constructed during the day, supplemented by occasional checks of his compass. Doc would be moving into position now, circling wide to approach their original vantage point from the opposite direction. It was a gamble, splitting up always was, but the alternative was to remain passive targets for a sniper who already knew their location. Mick's gut told him the Phantom would follow him rather than remain in position. Professional curiosity, if nothing else, one predator recognizing another. The plan was simple. Mick would lead their hunter on a careful chase while Doc circled behind to eliminate the threat. Simple, but not easy. Everything depended on timing, on instincts honed through months of jungle warfare, on the unspoken communication that existed between men who had faced death together. As he navigated a particularly steep section, Mick's boot slipped on the rain-slick ground. He caught himself against a tree trunk, but the sudden movement sent a shower of water cascading from the leaves above. Too much noise, too much disturbance of the natural environment. Amateur mistake, the kind that got men killed. Mick froze, becoming part of the jungle's darkness, his breathing shallow and controlled. Water dripped from the brim of his boonie hat, tracing cold paths down his face like phantom tears. For a long moment, nothing moved except the rain. Then, almost imperceptible through the constant patter of water on leaves, came a sound that didn't belong, the subtle shift of weight on wet ground. Not an animal. Too deliberate. Too controlled. He's here. The certainty bloomed in Mick's mind like a dark flower. Not just nearby. Here. Close enough to touch. close enough to kill. Slowly, without moving his head, Mick let his eyes scan the darkness around him. Nothing but shadows within shadows, the familiar shapes of the jungle transformed by rain and night into an alien landscape. But somewhere in that darkness, another pair of eyes was watching him. Another mind was calculating angles, distances, probabilities. Another finger was perhaps resting alongside a trigger, ready to apply the gentle pressure that would end a life. For the first time since entering the jungle, Mick felt something beyond the professional calculation of a hunter stalking prey. He felt seen, not just as a target, but as an equal, a worthy adversary. And in that moment of recognition, a strange, unbidden thought surfaced. We're not so different, you and I. The rain continued to fall, masking all sound except the pounding of Mick's heart in his ears. Somewhere in the darkness, the phantom waited, as motionless and patient as Mick himself. Two predators locked in a deadly game, each suddenly aware that they were not just hunter, but also hunted. 3 days of rain had transformed the jungle into a steaming, primordial swamp. Water dripped constantly from every leaf and branch, creating a perpetual mist that hung in the air like suspended time. The ground had become treacherous, a sucking morass that seemed determined to claim each boot with every step. Mick and Doc had reunited at dawn after their risky night maneuver, both men empty-handed and increasingly frustrated. The phantom remained exactly that. A shadow, a rumor, a presence felt but never seen. "He's toying with us," Doc muttered as they picked their way along a narrow animal trail that wound through the dense undergrowth. His usual levity had eroded under the constant strain of vigilance, replaced by a terse irritability that matched Mick's own darkening mood. 3 days, Mick, 3 days of this cat-and-mouse bullshit." Mick said nothing, conserving his energy and focus for the terrain ahead. The lack of sleep was beginning to take its toll, his reactions a fraction slower, his thoughts occasionally drifting into dangerous territory. Twice now he'd caught himself staring at nothing, lost in memories of home that seemed increasingly like scenes from someone else's life. They were approaching a small clearing, one of the few breaks in the dense canopy that might allow them to get their bearings. Mick raised his hand, signaling a halt before they broke cover. Something about the open space ahead made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. "I don't like it," he said softly, scanning the tree line on the far side. "Too exposed." Doc nodded, dropping to one knee beside him. "So we go around again." His tone made it clear he was reaching the limits of his patience. "At some point, we're gonna have to take a risk, Mick. We can't outwait this guy forever." "Not asking for forever," Mick replied. "Just long enough to—" The sound registered before his conscious mind could process it, a whip-crack report that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, followed by the distinctive whine of a bullet passing far too close to his head. Instinct took over. Mick tackled Doc sideways, both men crashing into the undergrowth as a second shot splintered the tree trunk where they had been standing. "Contact!" Doc hissed unnecessarily, his body already flattened against the muddy ground. "Where's it coming from?" Mick's mind raced, calculating angles based on the sound of the shots and the impact point on the tree. Northeast, elevated position, maybe 400 meters. His voice was steady despite the adrenaline surging through his system. "Stay down. He's got the high ground." A third shot kicked up mud just inches from Mick's face, close enough that he felt the spatter against his cheek. Not random fire. Each shot was coming progressively closer, like the shooter was adjusting his aim with surgical precision. "He's walking it in," Mick said grimly. "Next one won't miss." Doc's face was a mask of controlled fear, his eyes darting to the dense foliage to their right. "We can't stay here. On 3 we move, separate directions. I'll draw his fire, you circle wide and get behind him." Mick checked his rifle, already calculating his own route through the jungle. 1, 2, 3. Mick exploded from cover, zigzagging toward a cluster of trees that might offer momentary protection. The expected shot came almost immediately, throwing up a spray of vegetation to his left. Close, but not close enough. The phantom was good, but even good snipers struggled with moving targets at range. Diving behind the thick trunk of a banyan tree, Mick pressed his back against the rough bark and fought to control his breathing. Across the clearing, he caught a glimpse of Doc disappearing into the foliage, moving with surprising speed for a man of his lanky build. Now the real game began. Min cursed silently as his fourth shot missed the fleeing American. The sniper moved well, unpredictably, using the terrain to his advantage. A worthy opponent, just as Min had sensed. He adjusted his position slightly, scanning for movement through his scope. The Americans had split up, a standard tactic, but no less effective for its predictability. One would try to flank while the other held position. The question was, which one should he track? The answer came easily enough. The sniper was the primary threat. The spotter was dangerous only as an extension of his partner's eyes. Eliminate the sniper, and the mission would be accomplished. Lieutenant Thao would be pleased, and perhaps the dreams of his sister's broken body would grant him one night of uninterrupted sleep. Yet even as he tracked the faint disturbances in the foliage that marked the sniper's passage, a strange reluctance tempered Min's resolve. This dance between predators had awakened something he'd thought long dead, a sense of professional respect, perhaps even a kind of kinship with the American sniper. They were mirror images, separated only by the accidents of birth and circumstance, that had placed them on opposite sides of this conflict. In another life, they might have shared techniques over rice wine, comparing notes on wind adjustment and bullet drop. In this life, only one would leave the jungle alive. Min pushed the thought aside, refocusing on the task at hand. The American was good at using cover, revealing himself only in fractional glimpses. A boot here, an elbow there, never enough for a clean shot. Patience would be required. Patience and perhaps a change in tactics. Carefully, ensuring his movement wouldn't betray his position, Min reached into the small pouch at his belt and withdrew a tarnished cartridge casing. With deliberate precision, he placed it on a rock near his position, angling it to catch the occasional shaft of sunlight that penetrated the canopy. A lure for a hunter. The glint of metal in the jungle was like a beacon. It could be a weapon, a watch, a canteen, any number of things that no experienced soldier would leave exposed, but it would draw the eye, draw attention, create the momentary distraction Min needed. With the trap set, he settled back into position, his breathing slowing to an almost imperceptible rhythm as he prepared for the long wait ahead. Mick crouched in the shadow of a large root system, straining to detect any sound above the constant drip of water from the canopy overhead. 20 minutes had passed since he'd taken cover, and the jungle had settled back into its deceptive calm. The Phantom was playing it smart. No follow-up shots to give away his position, no movement to catch the eye. Just silence and the oppressive weight of being watched. Mick knew the feeling intimately. How many hours had he spent in similar positions, rifle trained on a patch of jungle where intelligence suggested enemy movement might occur? How many days merged into nights as he waited for the perfect shot? Muscles cramping, skin crawling with insects, mind drifting into dangerous territories of doubt and memory? Focus, he told himself harshly. Stay in the moment. But the moment seemed stretched to the breaking point, filled with nothing but the rasp of his own breathing and the distant calls of birds returning to their interrupted routines. His earpiece crackled softly. Doc, checking in from wherever he'd taken position. "I'm on the northeast ridge," Doc whispered, his voice barely audible through the static. "Can't see our friend, but I've got good sight lines on the most likely hide positions." "Stay put," Mick responded. "I'll try to draw his fire, give you a better fix on his location." "Roger that. But Mick..." Doc hesitated. "Be careful, this guy's not shooting like someone who wants to miss." Mick allowed himself a grim smile at that. Of course the Phantom wasn't shooting to miss. He was shooting to kill, just like Mick himself would be doing once he had a target. That was the bargain they'd all made when they took up the sniper's rifle. To become death incarnate, to end lives from a distance with cold precision, never seeing the light fade from the eyes of the men they killed. 23 confirmed. Each one somebody's son, maybe somebody's father. Each one a life ended with the gentle pressure of his finger. The number seemed both massive and trivial in this moment, a scorecard in a game with stakes too high to contemplate. Shaking off the thought, Mick carefully surveyed his surroundings, plotting a route that would allow him to change position while minimizing his exposure. He needed to draw fire without becoming a casualty, a delicate balance that required perfect timing and a healthy dose of luck. Movement caught his eye, a brief flash of light from the ridge to his north. Just a momentary glint, there and gone so quickly he might have imagined it. But Mick's instincts screamed a warning. Too deliberate, too precisely placed. It's a trap. The realization came with cold certainty. The Phantom was trying to draw his attention, create a distraction while he lined up the real shot from another position. But two could play that game. "Doc," Mick whispered into his comm, "I'm going to need a distraction. On my mark, I want you to fire 3 shots at grid coordinates Echo 7. Not trying to hit anything, just make some noise." "Copy that," Doc replied after a slight hesitation. "But what exactly am I?" "Just trust me," Mick interrupted. 3 shots, 30 seconds apart, start on my mark." He checked his rifle one last time, then took a deep breath. "Mark." The first shot rang out, its echo rebounding through the jungle like a physical force. Mick was already moving, using the distraction to close the distance toward where he'd seen the flash of light. Not directly toward it. That's what the Phantom would expect, but in a wide arc that would bring him into position from an unexpected angle. The second shot came precisely 30 seconds later, as Mick was picking his way across a shallow stream. He froze, becoming part of the landscape, counting heartbeats until the distraction had served its purpose. Movement. A shadow shifting against shadows. Just a flicker in his peripheral vision, but enough to confirm his suspicions. The Phantom had changed positions, using Doc's shots as cover for his own movement, exactly as Mick had hoped. The third shot echoed through the trees, and Mick surged forward, closing the final distance to where he'd glimpsed the movement. His M40 was at his shoulder, scope scanning the dense foliage for any sign of his quarry. Nothing. Just empty jungle and the maddening sensation of having missed something obvious. Then he saw it. The cartridge casing, deliberately placed to catch the sun. The trap he'd recognized and thought he was avoiding. But if this is the trap, then where? The realization came a heartbeat too late. The soft snap of a twig behind him was his only warning before a shot rang out, so close it left his ears ringing. Mick dove sideways, felt the searing heat of a bullet grazing his upper arm as he rolled into cover behind a fallen tree. Blood seeped through a tear in his sleeve, not serious but enough to remind him that the next shot wouldn't miss. The Phantom had doubled back, using Mick's own tactics against him. A counter-ambush executed with flawless precision. For the first time since entering the jungle, Mick felt something beyond professional respect for his adversary. He felt a cold, creeping fear. The Phantom wasn't just good, he was better. Min watched the American take cover, noting with professional detachment the streak of blood that marked his successful shot. Not a kill, but close enough to change the dynamic of their confrontation. The American would be more cautious now, more defensive. The psychological advantage had shifted. Yet as he lined up another shot, something stayed his finger. The American had anticipated his trap, had almost turned it against him. Few opponents had ever come so close to outmaneuvering Min on his own hunting grounds. A strange emotion surfaced, something like admiration, mixed with a wistfulness that caught him by surprise. How long had it been since he'd faced a challenge worthy of his skills? How long since he'd felt truly alive in this endless grinding war? The American was moving again, staying low, using the fallen tree as cover. A good tactical choice, but one that exposed his flank for just a fraction of a second. Min's finger tightened on the trigger, then relaxed. Not yet. The game was too interesting to end so quickly. Instead, he fired a deliberate miss, the bullet splintering wood just inches from the American's position. A warning. A message that death had been postponed, not prevented. The American reacted instantly, rolling into denser cover and returning fire in one fluid motion. The shot was well placed, close enough to Min's position to confirm the American had a good sense of his location, but not so close as to force him to abandon his hide. Respect. They were showing each other respect in the only language available. To them, the precise placement of bullets meant to communicate rather than kill. For now. The exchange of fire continued for several minutes, a conversation conducted in gunshots and near misses that left Mick both frustrated and strangely exhilarated. The Phantom was playing with him, demonstrating his skill while deliberately avoiding a killing shot. But why? The question nagged at Mick as he changed positions yet again, the wound on his arm throbbing in time with his accelerated heartbeat. Professional courtesy between snipers? Sadistic enjoyment of the hunt? Or something else entirely? Mick, what the hell is going on down there? Doc's voice came through the earpiece, tense with concern. That's a lot of lead being exchanged for no casualties. He's toying with me, Mick replied, his voice tight as he scanned the ridgeline for any sign of movement. Could have taken me out at least twice, but he's deliberately missing. So what's his game? Damned if I know. Mick wiped sweat from his eyes, trying to think through the fog of adrenaline and fatigue. But I'm getting real tired of being the mouse in this little game. A plan was forming in Mick's mind. Risky, potentially suicidal, but the best option in a situation that was rapidly deteriorating. The Phantom had the high ground, better cover, and the psychological edge. Continuing the current exchange would only end one way. Doc, I need you to work your way back to that stream crossing we passed this morning, Mick said, his decision made. Then head due south until you hit our fallback position. Wait for me there. Like hell, Doc responded immediately. I'm not leaving you out here alone with this psycho. That's an order, Corporal, Mick snapped, using rank in a way he rarely did with Doc. This isn't a two-man job anymore. It's sniper against sniper. My game, my rules. There was a long pause filled only with the sound of Doc's breathing. And if you don't make the rendezvous? Mick smiled grimly, though there was no one to see it. Then you tell command the Phantom lives up to his reputation, and they should send someone better next time. Another pause, then 24 hours. If you're not at the fallback by this time tomorrow, I'm coming back with every gunship and grunt I can convince to join the party. Fair enough, Mick agreed. Now move out. I'll cover you. He waited until Doc's acknowledgement came through, then took a deep breath and prepared for the most dangerous bluff of his life. Standing partially upright, he deliberately exposed himself for just a fraction of a second before ducking back into cover. The expected shot came instantly, splintering bark where his head had been moments before. But it wasn't a killing shot. Still, a deliberate miss, though close enough to send a clear message. I could end this anytime I choose. Mick returned fire, aiming at a shadow that might have been the Phantom, or might have been nothing more than a trick of the light. Then he was moving again, working his way laterally across the slope, trying to gain enough separation to execute the next phase of his improvised plan. Doc would be moving by now, hopefully making good his escape while the Phantom's attention remained fixed on Mick. That was the first priority, getting his spotter to safety. The second was changing the terms of engagement. If the Phantom wanted to play games, Mick would oblige him, but he'd make damn sure he was the one setting the rules. Min watched with growing respect as the American executed a series of movements designed to cover his partner's retreat. Selfless, tactically sound, the mark of a professional who valued his team over his own safety. For a moment, Min felt a pang of something like envy. How long had it been since he'd fought alongside comrades he trusted so completely? Lieutenant Thao and the others respected his skills, valued his contributions to their cause, but they maintained a careful distance. The Phantom was a weapon to be deployed, not a brother in arms to be embraced. The American was changing tactics now, becoming more aggressive, more unpredictable, drawing attention to himself, away from his retreating partner. A classic diversion, but executed with a skill that demanded acknowledgement. Min adjusted his position, maintaining visual contact as the American worked his way across the slope. Their deadly dance had entered a new phase, one sniper against another, stripped of support, relying solely on individual skill and intuition. As the light began to fade from the jungle, casting long shadows that blurred the line between reality and imagination, Min felt a curious lightening of his spirit. For the first time in years, he was facing an opponent worthy of his full attention, his complete respect. Tomorrow would bring resolution, one way or another. One would live, one would die. The equation was simple, the outcome binary. Yet as he settled into position for the night, rifle close at hand, Min found himself hoping that the final confrontation would be worthy of the chase that had preceded it. That the American would continue to surprise him, to challenge him, right up until the moment Min sent him to join the ghosts that haunted them both. Darkness settled over the jungle like a shroud, bringing with it a silence broken only by the distant calls of night birds and the constant symphony of insects. Mick pressed himself against the base of a massive tree, his breathing slow and controlled despite the throbbing pain in his arm. The day's confrontation had confirmed what he'd suspected from the beginning. The Phantom was not just a skilled sniper but a tactician of the highest order. He thought 3 moves ahead, anticipated counters, and adapted with fluid precision to changing circumstances. But he'd also revealed something unexpected: restraint. He could have ended the hunt multiple times but chose not to. That suggested a motivation beyond simple elimination of an enemy. Perhaps professional curiosity, perhaps a desire to test himself against a worthy opponent, perhaps something else entirely. Whatever the reason, it gave Mick a slim advantage. The Phantom wanted to prolong the game. Mick just wanted to survive it. As he checked the makeshift bandage on his arm, grimacing at the sting of antiseptic from his field kit, Mick's thoughts turned to Angela and little Mikey. The photograph in his breast pocket was worn at the edges from constant handling, but he knew every detail by heart. Angela's smile, slightly crooked but achingly beautiful. Mikey's serious expression, so at odds with his 3-year-old face, as if he was already preparing for a world that would ask too much of him too soon. Would they understand if he didn't come home? Would they forgive him for choosing this life? This death? The questions had no answers, only the hollow echo of regret that seemed to accompany every quiet moment in this godforsaken jungle. With an effort of will, Mick pushed the thoughts away. Sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford, not with dawn only hours away and a final confrontation looming. The Phantom would be waiting, watching, planning his next move with the same cold precision that had kept him alive while so many others fell. But Mick would be ready. The hunt had become personal now. No longer just a mission, but a test of everything he'd become in this war. His skill, his resolve, his humanity. As he closed his eyes for a few precious minutes of rest, Mick's hand drifted to the rifle at his side. An unconscious gesture of reassurance, like a child clutching a beloved toy in the darkness. The irony wasn't lost on him. His lifeline, his security blanket, was an instrument designed for one purpose only: to end life at a distance, with precision and without mercy. 23 confirmed, each one somebody's son, maybe somebody's father. Each one a life ended with the gentle pressure of his finger. Tomorrow that number would change, one way or another. Dawn arrived with a mist that clung to the jungle like reluctant ghosts. Mick awoke instantly, the transition from sleep to full alertness accomplished in the space of a heartbeat. A survival skill honed through months of combat. His arm throbbed dully beneath the field dressing, but the bleeding had stopped. Small mercies. He allowed himself 30 seconds of stillness to listen to the jungle coming alive around him. Birds calling, insects buzzing. The occasional rustle of small animals moving through the undergrowth. Normal sounds. Safe sounds. For now. Rising to a crouch, Mick checked his equipment with practiced efficiency. Rifle clean, despite the humidity. 6 rounds remaining in the magazine, 24 more in his pack. Water purification tablets, 2 days' worth of rations. First aid supplies already depleted by tending to his wound. Enough to finish the mission, not enough to delay. The original plan had been for Doc to reach the fallback position and wait. 24 hours, and then call in support if Mick didn't show. But plans rarely survived contact with the enemy, and Mick knew better than to rely on timelines in a fluid situation. The Phantom would be waiting, watching, The game had escalated from cautious stalking to direct confrontation, and now it had become something else entirely. A personal duel between two men who understood each other in ways their respective allies never could. Mick's hand moved, unconsciously, to the photograph in his breast pocket. Angular felt impossibly distant in this moment, a dream of another life, another self. The man she had married, the father who had kissed his son goodbye, seemed to belong to someone else's memories. How many times had he imagined his return? The tearful reunion at the airfield, Mikey running into his arms, their life resuming, as if the war had been nothing more than an unpleasant interruption. But that fantasy grew more tenuous with each passing day, each confirmed kill, each moment spent in this green hell where morality blurred into survival, and survival blurred into something darker. 23 confirmed. Each one somebody's son, maybe somebody's father. Each one a life ended with the gentle pressure of his finger. Mick closed his eyes briefly, fighting back the wave of doubt that threatened to overwhelm him. This wasn't the time for philosophical crises. The phantom was out there waiting. Everything else, regret, uncertainty, the growing hollowness in his chest where conviction used to reside, would have to wait. Survival first, redemption later, if later ever came. Min moved through the pre-dawn mist like a spirit, each step placed with deliberate care to avoid disturbing the natural rhythms of the jungle. The American would be awake by now, preparing for the day's confrontation, with the same professional diligence that had kept him alive thus far. Good. Min wanted him at his best. The admission surprised him, running counter to years of tactical training and the ruthless pragmatism Lieutenant Thao had instilled in all her operatives. A wounded, exhausted enemy was an easier target. That was simple logic, divorced from emotion or sentiment. Yet Min found himself hoping the American's wound wasn't serious, that he'd had enough rest to maintain his edge. The hunt had evolved into something beyond a simple elimination mission. It had become a test of skill, of will, of the philosophies that had shaped them into the weapons they now were. As he paused to listen to the jungle around him, Min's thoughts drifted to the small village near Hue where he had grown up, the rice field stretching to the horizon, glowing gold in the late afternoon sun. His father's patient instructions as he taught Min to hunt, to track, to understand the language of the forest. Never take more than you need, his father had told him. The forest provides, but it also remembers. Kill without respect, without necessity, and the spirits will turn their backs on you. What would his father think of him now? Of the hunter who had become a harvester of men's souls? Of the son who had traded the reverence of the hunt for the cold calculation of the sniper's hide? The memory of his sister intruded then, her broken body cradled in their mother's lifeless arms, both buried beneath the rubble of American bombs. The familiar rage rose within him, burning away doubt and regret like morning mist in the summer sun. This was necessary. This was just. Each American life he took was an offering to ghosts who would never rest. Each kill a small measure of balance, in a war that recognized no scales but those weighted with blood. And yet, something had changed during this hunt. The American sniper was not an abstraction, not a faceless representation of the force that had destroyed Min's family. He was a man skilled, determined, worthy of respect. A mirror image of Min himself, separated only by the accidents of birth and allegiance that had placed them on opposite sides of this conflict. The recognition was uncomfortable, introducing complexity where clarity had once reigned. Min pushed, the thoughts aside, focusing instead on the tactical problem at hand. The American would be moving toward higher ground, seeking advantage in elevation and sight lines. Predictable, but no less effective for its predictability. The question was, which route would he take? The eastern ridge offered better cover but limited mobility. The southern approach provided multiple escape routes, but exposed him to detection from the valley below, where Viet Cong patrols occasionally operated. Min considered the American's thinking, his demonstrated caution balanced against the urgency of his mission. After a moment's calculation, he turned west, moving parallel to the route he believed the American would choose. Not to intercept, not yet, but to maintain the unsettling pressure of unseen observation that had proven so effective thus far. The psychological game continued. "We should have waited for support," Doc said for the third time in as many hours, his voice tight with concern as he watched Mick check the crude map they'd been provided. "Command would have sent a whole platoon if we'd asked." Mick didn't look up from the map. "And the Phantom would have been long gone before they arrived. You know how this works, Doc. Window of opportunity closes fast out here." They'd reunited at dawn, Doc having doubled back despite Mick's orders, a decision that had prompted a terse exchange of words followed by grudging acceptance. Whatever their disagreements, they were a team. They would finish this mission together, or not at all. "I know how this is supposed to work," Doc countered, gesturing at the wound on Mick's arm. "What I don't know is why you're so hell-bent on playing this guy's game instead of changing the rules." Mick finally looked up, his expression unreadable. "Because it's what I'd do in his position." "That's what worries me," Doc muttered, adjusting the medical pack on his shoulder. "You're starting to think like him. Next thing you know, you'll be growing a beard and joining the revolution." The joke fell flat between them, the attempt at levity highlighting, rather than relieving the tension, that had been building since their first encounter with the Phantom. Mick returned his attention to the map, tracing their planned route with a dirt-smudged finger. "Ridge to the west gives us the best visibility. From there, we should be able to spot any movement in the valley." "And be spotted ourselves," Doc pointed out. "That ridge is exposed as hell on the southern face." "He already knows where we are," Mick replied with a certainty that brooked no argument. "Has since we entered the valley. This isn't about hiding anymore. It's about choosing the ground for the final confrontation." Doc studied his friend's face, noting the subtle changes that had occurred over the past days. The deepening lines around his eyes, the tightness in his jaw. The flattening effect that suggested Mick was withdrawing into some internal fortress, accessible to no one, perhaps not even himself. "Listen, Mick," Doc began, then hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't sound like pity or, worse, fear. "When this is over, maybe it's time to request a rotation back to division. You've done your tour, plus some. Nobody would question it." Mick's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, a momentary break in the professional mask quickly suppressed. "Let's focus on making sure there is an after this, Doc, one step at a time." He folded the map and stowed it in his breast pocket, his movements crisp and decisive. "We head west. I take point, 5-meter spread, minimal communication unless absolutely necessary." Doc nodded, recognizing the shift from Mick his friend to Sergeant Riley, Marine Scout Sniper. The transition was familiar, necessary, but somehow more jarring than usual, as if the line between the two identities was blurring, the demarcation less distinct with each passing day. As they moved out, Doc couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that regardless of the outcome with the Phantom, something essential was being lost in these jungle shadows, something that might never find its way back to the light. By mid-afternoon, the heat had become a physical presence, pressing down. With malicious intent, the air was so thick with humidity that each breath felt like drowning, and sweat poured down Mick's face in constant streams, despite the relative shade of the jungle canopy. They'd been climbing steadily for hours, making their way up the western ridge through terrain that seemed designed specifically to exhaust and demoralize. Fallen trees created obstacles that had to be navigated carefully. Vines thick as a man's arm hung like tripwires across their path. The ground itself was treacherous, seemingly solid one moment, then giving way to hidden sinkholes the next. And always, the sensation of being watched, unseen eyes tracking their progress, patient, calculating, waiting for the inevitable mistake. "Mick," Doc called softly from a few meters behind, his voice strained. "Hold up a sec." Mick paused, turning to see Doc leaning against a tree trunk, his face pale beneath the streaks of camouflage paint. "You okay?" Doc nodded, but the gesture lacked conviction. Just need a minute, getting lightheaded. Concern flared through Mick's professional detachment. Doc was as tough as they came, a veteran of 3 tours who'd seen the worst this war had to offer without breaking stride. If he was showing weakness now? "When's the last time you drank?" Mick asked, moving to his friend's side. "Not about water," Doc replied, wiping his forearm across his sweat-soaked brow. "Started feeling off last night. Thought it was just fatigue, but it's getting worse." Mick studied Doc's face more carefully, noting the dilated pupils, the slight tremor in his hands. Malaria, maybe, or one of the dozen other tropical diseases that swept through units like seasonal flu back home. Whatever it was, it meant trouble they couldn't afford. "Let me see your pack," Mick said, decision already made. Doc started to protest, then seemed to think better of it. He slipped the heavy rucksack from his shoulders and handed it over without comment. Mick quickly redistributed the essential supplies between their 2 packs, leaving Doc with only his medical kit and enough rations for the return journey. "You're heading back to the fallback position now." "Like hell I am," Doc objected, straightening, away from the tree through what was clearly a significant effort of will. "We stick together, remember? That's the deal." "Deal changes when one of us becomes a liability," Mick said, keeping his tone matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. "You can barely stand, Doc. Another hour in this heat and I'll be carrying you." "So we both go back," Doc countered. "Call in support. Do this by the book for once." Mick shook his head. "We're too close. He's nearby. I can feel it." He gestured at the ridge above them. "One more push to the top, and I'll have the vantage I need to end this." Or he will, Mick thought, but didn't say. The possibility hung between them, unspoken but understood. Doc's expression shifted from stubborn resistance to resigned concern. "This isn't just about the mission anymore, is it? This is personal for you." Mick couldn't deny it. Somewhere during the past days of stalking and being stalked, of testing and being tested, the line between professional duty and personal challenge had blurred beyond recognition. The Phantom had ceased to be simply a target and had become… what? An opponent? A peer? A dark reflection of what Mick himself might become if the war continued to strip away his humanity piece by piece. "I need to finish this," Mick said finally, the admission costing him more than he'd expected. "Need to know if I still can." Doc held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You've got until dawn tomorrow. If you're not back by then, I'm calling in every resource command has in this sector to find you." "Fair enough," Mick agreed, handing Doc's lightened pack back to him. "Now go. Follow the stream bed we crossed an hour back. It'll lead you to the rendezvous point faster than backtracking our route." Doc shouldered his pack, then extended his hand. "Be smart out there, Mick. I'm not explaining to Angela why her husband decided to play Ahab with a Viet Cong sniper." Mick grasped his friend's hand firmly. "I'll be careful. Just focus on getting yourself back safely." They both knew the promises were empty. Survival here depended on factors beyond their control. But the ritual of farewell required them, a talisman against the chaos of war. As Doc turned to leave, a sudden impulse seized Mick. "Doc, wait." He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew the worn photograph of Angela and Mikey. "Hold on to this for me, would you? Just until I get back." Doc took the photograph, understanding the significance of the gesture. "I'll keep it safe," he promised, carefully tucking it into his own breast pocket. "You can pick it up over beers when this is all over." Mick nodded, his throat unexpectedly tight. "See you soon, Doc." "Count on it," Doc replied with a ghost of his usual grin, then turned and disappeared into the jungle, moving with the careful precision of a man forcing his body to obey commands it desperately wanted to refuse. Mick watched until Doc was out of sight, then turned back to the ridge that loomed above, his resolve hardening into something cold and clear and dangerous. Alone now, just him and the Phantom, and whatever judgment awaited at the end of this hunt. Min adjusted his position on the ridgeline, seeking relief from the cramps that plagued his legs after hours of near-perfect stillness. The American and his spotter had separated, an unexpected development that suggested either a change in tactics, or some unforeseen complication. Through his scope, Min had watched the shorter one continue up the ridge alone, moving with the measured caution of a man who knew he was being observed but refused to show fear. The spotter had headed back down toward the stream, his movements lacking their usual fluid grace. Injury, perhaps, or illness. Whatever the reason, the separation presented both opportunity and challenge. The American sniper alone was more vulnerable, but also more focused. No distractions, no divided attention. Just a single-minded hunter moving inexorably toward a confrontation that had begun to feel preordained, as if their paths had always been destined to cross here. In this forgotten corner of a war neither of them had started, but both were determined to survive. Min settled back into position, his rifle a comforting weight against his shoulder. The American would reach the ridgeline within the hour if he maintained his current pace. From there, the final act would begin, a deadly game of chess played, across rocky terrain with no room for error and no possibility of draw. One would live, one would die. The equation was simple, the outcome binary. Yet as Min waited, his thoughts returned unbidden to the dream that had plagued him the night before. His sister, whole and unbroken, standing in their family's rice field. The sun setting behind her, casting her small frame in silhouette. "Is this what Father taught us?" she had asked, her voice simultaneously childlike and ancient. "To become what we hate?" Min had awakened with tears on his face for the first time since the day he'd buried his family. The emotion had disturbed him, introducing doubt where certainty had once reigned. Was this endless cycle of violence and retribution truly honoring his family's memory? Or was it transforming him into something his father would no longer recognize? The questions had no answers, only the hollow echo of loss that seemed to accompany every quiet moment in this endless war. With an effort of will, Min pushed the thoughts away. Sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford, not with the American closing in and a final confrontation looming. Everything else, doubt, uncertainty, the fading memory of who he had been before the bombs fell, would have to wait. Survival first, redemption later, if later ever came. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when Mick finally reached the ridgeline. The climb had been brutal, steeper than anticipated, with sections that required more climbing than hiking. His wound throbbed in angry protest, and fatigue settled into his muscles like lead weights. But he'd made it, and the position was worth the effort. From this vantage point, the valley spread out below him in a panorama of greens and browns, intersected by the silver ribbon of a stream that wound its way southeast toward the distant coast. Visibility was excellent in all directions, the best he'd had since entering this hellish jungle nearly a week ago. If the Phantom was down there, Mick would spot him, if he was down there. The cold certainty that had been Mick's companion throughout the climb suddenly wavered. What if the Phantom had anticipated this move and was already positioned elsewhere? What if this entire painful ascent had been for nothing? Doubt crept in like jungle mist, insidious and disorienting. Mick forced it aside, focusing instead on the tactical requirements of his position. Clear fields of fire, multiple avenues of approach, concealment from below without sacrificing visibility. Standard procedure, simple, mechanical, comforting in its familiarity. As he settled into position, rifle braced against a convenient rock formation, Mick allowed himself a moment to assess his physical state. The wound in his arm had reopened during the climb, blood seeping through the field dressing to stain his sleeve crimson. His mouth was dry despite careful rationing of water. His hands, usually steady as bedrock, trembled slightly with fatigue, not ideal conditions for precision shooting. But then, nothing about this mission had been ideal from the start. Through his scope, Mick methodically scanned the valley below, moving in a disciplined grid pattern to ensure no detail escaped his attention. Shadows lengthened as the sun continued its descent, creating pools of darkness that could conceal a dozen men, or a single patient hunter. Nothing moved except the natural rhythms of the jungle. No sign of human presence. No indication that the Phantom was anywhere within range. Yet the sensation of being watched remained, prickling the hairs on the back of Mick's neck with a certainty that transcended rational observation. He's here. Somewhere. The thought had barely formed when something caught Mick's attention, a flicker of movement at the extreme edge of his field of vision. He swung his scope to focus on the spot, pulse accelerating despite his conscious effort to remain calm. Nothing. Just trees and shadows and the gathering dusk. Had he imagined it? Was fatigue playing tricks on his senses? Mick returned to his methodical scan, but his concentration had been broken. Doubt crept back in, bringing with it memories he'd been holding at bay through sheer force of will. Angela's face on their wedding day, radiant with a joy that seemed to illuminate the entire church. Mikey's first steps, tentative and wobbling, his small face a study in determination. The softness of Angela's skin against his the night before, he shipped out, their bodies finding a desperate comfort in each other that words couldn't provide. "Come back to us," she had whispered in the darkness. Not, "Stay safe," or "Be careful." Just, "Come back to us." As if she understood that the man who left might not be the same one who returned, regardless of physical wounds. How right she had been. The Mick Riley who had kissed his family goodbye at San Diego International Airport 2 years ago might as well be a stranger now, a ghost from another lifetime, naive and untested despite his training. The man who would return, if he returned at all, was something else entirely. Harder, colder, weighted with the knowledge of what he had done and what had been done to him. 23 confirmed, each one somebody's son, maybe somebody's father. Each one a life ended with the gentle pressure of his finger. The number had been a source of professional pride once. Now it felt like an accusation. Mick blinked, realizing his focus had drifted dangerously. The light was fading rapidly now, the jungle transforming from vibrant greens to muted grays as dusk approached. Soon darkness would render his elevated position useless, forcing a decision. Maintain his current hide through the night, or find more defensible ground for the hours of vulnerability ahead. Before he could decide, movement caught his eye again, more distinct this time, a shadow separating from shadows at the base of the ridge. Mick swung his scope to the spot, breath held, finger hovering near the trigger. For a heart-stopping moment he thought he glimpsed a face, gaunt, determined, watchful. Then it was gone, lost in the gathering darkness, leaving only the unsettling certainty that he had been seen in turn. The phantom had found him. Nightmare visions flooded Mick's mind. A knife in the darkness, a silent approach while he slept, a bullet from a position he hadn't thought to check. Death coming for him as it had come for so many others, indifferent to skill or training, or the desperate will to survive. "Get a grip, Riley," he admonished himself harshly. Fear kills faster than any bullet. But the rational self-rebuke did little to quell the primitive terror that rose within him. He was alone, injured, exhausted, facing an enemy on ground of their choosing in conditions that grew more disadvantageous by the minute. For the first time since beginning this hunt, Mick allowed himself to consider the very real possibility that he might not make it out alive. The admission should have been devastating. Instead, it brought with it a strange, unexpected clarity. If these were to be his final hours, they would count for something. He would face the phantom as an equal, not just in skill, but in the recognition of what they had both become in service to causes larger than themselves. Hunters, killers, men carrying the weight of lives taken, and the knowledge that, given the same circumstances, they would take them again. As darkness claimed the jungle completely, Mick made his decision. He would maintain his position through the night. Attack, when it came, would find him prepared, ready. It was all any soldier could hope for in the end. Night in the jungle had its own heartbeat, a rhythm of sounds and silences that Mick had learned to read like a familiar book. The steady chorus of insects, the occasional call of night birds, the rustling of nocturnal creatures moving through the undergrowth. Normal sounds, safe sounds. Then the disruptions, the sudden cessation of insect noise, the abrupt silence that spread like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Danger sounds, warning sounds. Mick had been listening to these disruptions move steadily closer for the past hour, tracking the phantom's approach through the changes in the jungle's night song. Not close enough for visual confirmation, but undeniably there, a predator moving, with patient deliberation toward his prey, or perhaps toward his fellow predator. The distinction felt important somehow, though Mick couldn't have articulated why. Equal opponents in a deadly game versus hunter and hunted. The difference was semantic but profound. He shifted slightly, easing the cramp in his right leg without disturbing the carefully arranged cover he'd established. The ridgeline position remained defensible, but the advantage of elevation had been neutralized by darkness. Now it was about patience, awareness, and the psychological fortitude to maintain vigilance through hours of near-total sensory deprivation. Mick had done this before, countless nights in observation posts, sniper hides, forward reconnaissance positions. The quiet solitude of the watch was familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. What wasn't familiar was the growing sense of connection to the man hunting him. With each passing hour, the phantom became less an abstraction and more a presence Mick could almost understand. A mirror image moving through the same darkness, guided by the same training, bound by the same deadly purpose. As he scanned the jungle below his position, eyes straining to distinguish movement from shadow, Mick found his thoughts drifting to unexpected territories. Who was the man he faced? What path had led him to become the ghost that American forces feared? Did he have a family waiting somewhere praying for his safe return just as Angela prayed for Mick's? The questions had no answers, only the hollow space of speculation that seemed to expand with each passing moment of this strange, suspended time between action and consequence. Dawn was still hours away. The hunt would resume with the light. But for now there was only this moment of stillness, of waiting, of reflection that bordered on something like understanding. 200 meters below, concealed in the shadow of a massive banyan tree, Min watched the American's position through his night scope. The device, a trophy taken from a dead Australian advisor months earlier, gave him a crucial advantage in the gathering darkness, transforming the jungle into a world of ghostly greens and blacks. The American had chosen his position well, defensible, with clear lines of sight in multiple directions. But he'd made one critical miscalculation. In focusing on the threat from below, he'd left himself vulnerable to approach from the western face of the ridge, where a narrow game trail offered access to his flank. It would be simple enough to circle around, use the trail, and end this hunt with a single shot from less than 50 meters. The Australian scope made such a scenario not just possible but probable. Yet Min hesitated, his finger resting alongside the trigger guard rather than on the trigger itself. The expected satisfaction of having his prey finally cornered failed to materialize. Instead, he felt a curious reluctance, a sense that such an ending would somehow diminish both hunter and hunted. Lieutenant Thao would not understand such sentiment. "Finish it," she would say, her voice hard with the same hatred that had once burned so brightly in his own heart. "Each American death brings us closer to victory, closer to peace." Peace. The word had lost its meaning somewhere between the IAA bomb craters of his village and the countless jungle graves he'd created for American soldiers. What would peace look like for someone like him, shaped by war into a weapon with no other purpose? The question had no answer, only the aching emptiness that seemed to grow with each life he took. Through his scope, Min could see the American, adjusting his position slightly, a minute movement that nonetheless betrayed the discomfort of remaining still for so long. Despite fatigue, despite injury, the American maintained his discipline, professional, worthy of respect. In another life, they might have been friends, two men who understood the burden of distance, of precision, of responsibility that came with holding life and death in the gentle pressure of a finger. In this life, they were enemies, locked in, a dance that could end only one way. Yet as the night deepened around him, Min found himself questioning the inevitability of that ending. What would be accomplished by adding one more death to the thousands that had already stained this land? Would his sister's ghost rest easier? Would his parents' memory be honored by another life taken in their name? The doubts were unfamiliar, unwelcome, yet impossible to dismiss. Like jungle rot, they had found purchase in some hidden corner of his consciousness and now spread despite his efforts to contain them. Dawn was still hours away. The hunt would resume with the light. But for now there was only this moment of stillness, of waiting, of reflection that bordered on something like remorse. The first hint of gray on the eastern horizon came as a relief to Mick. Night watches always ended the same way, with the slow, almost imperceptible lightening of the sky that promised an end to vulnerability, a return to the world of the seeing rather than the blind. He'd maintained position through the endless hours of darkness, fighting fatigue with small sips of water and the iron discipline that had become second nature after months in country. The wound in his arm throbbed dully, a constant reminder of mortality that kept sleep at bay despite his body's desperate need for rest. Now as dawn approached, he allowed himself a careful stretch, easing the stiffness in muscles that had held the same position for too long. The jungle was coming alive around him, birds announcing the new day with increasing enthusiasm, insects changing their tune from the steady chorus of night to the more varied symphony of morning. Through his scope, the valley below gradually emerged from shadow, transformed from abstract shapes into distinct features. Trees, rocks, the silver thread of the stream, all reassuringly solid, real, mappable, no sign of movement, no hint of the phantom's position. But Mick knew he was out there watching, waiting. The certainty went beyond tactical assessment into something almost metaphysical, a connection formed through days of stalking and being stalked, of testing and being tested. As he scanned the valley with practiced precision, Mick's thoughts returned to the question that had haunted his night watch. Who was the man he hunted? Not the tactical consideration of capabilities and weaknesses, but the deeper question of identity, of humanity. Did he have a family? Parents who had raised him with love and hope for a better future? A wife who waited for his return, who touched the empty space beside her in bed at night and wondered if he was safe? As Angela surely did for Mick, the questions humanized his adversary in ways that were both uncomfortable and strangely comforting. Uncomfortable because it complicated the clean, clinical act of elimination that was Mick's mission. Comforting because it suggested a shared experience, a common ground that transcended the artificial divisions of politics and nations. We are not so different, you and I. The thought surfaced unbidden, bringing with it a wave of emotion Mick hadn't expected. Not fear or determination, but a profound sadness for all that this war had taken from both sides. Lives, certainly, but also innocence, humanity, the capacity to see the world in terms beyond the binary of friend and enemy, safe and dangerous. How many men had he killed without ever considering their stories, their dreams, their reasons for being in the same hellish place he found himself? 23 confirmed. Each one somebody's son, maybe somebody's father. Each one a life ended with the gentle pressure of his finger. For the first time, the number felt like more than a tally. It felt like a weight, pressing down with physical force, making it difficult to breathe despite the pre-dawn air that filled his lungs. Movement caught his eye, a flicker of change against the unchanging backdrop of the jungle. Mick's training took over, hands automatically adjusting his scope, body settling into the familiar shooting position that had become as natural as breathing. There, a shadow detaching from shadows at the edge of the clearing below, the phantom, moving with deliberate care, making his way toward the base of the ridge. Mick centered his crosshairs on the moving figure, finger resting lightly against the trigger. The shot was clear, the distance manageable even with the diminished light of early dawn. A breath, a squeeze, and his mission would be complete. One more confirmed kill to add to the tally that already haunted his dreams. But he hesitated. The questions that had occupied his night watch suddenly immediate and unavoidable. Who was this man? What was his story? If their positions were reversed, would the phantom show the same hesitation, the same reluctance to add one more death to a war already glutted with dying? The moment stretched, taut with possibility and consequence. Mick's finger remained on the trigger, neither applying pressure nor withdrawing. A decision balanced on the edge of a blade, with lives in the balance. Then the Phantom did something unexpected. He stopped in the middle of the clearing, standing fully upright, his rifle held negligently at his side rather than in firing position. For a long moment, he simply stood there, face tilted up toward Mick's position on the ridge, as if in acknowledgement of his adversary's presence. It was a gesture of either supreme confidence or suicidal recklessness, standing exposed when he knew exactly where Mick's hide was located, offering a target too perfect to miss. Through his scope, Mick could see the Phantom's face clearly for the first time, younger than he'd expected, with high cheekbones and eyes that held a weariness at odds with his age. Not the monster of American briefings, but a man as exhausted and burdened by the war as Mick himself. The perfect shot remained available, uncontested. The mission could end here, now, with a single trigger pull. Instead, Mick slowly withdrew his finger from the trigger, a decision made not through conscious thought but through some deeper recognition that transcended training and duty. Not like this, not without understanding. The Phantom held his position for another long moment, then nodded once, a gesture so small it might have been imagined, before melting back into the jungle's edge. Message delivered. Message received. The hunt continued, but the rules had changed in ways neither man could fully articulate. Min moved through the morning jungle with mechanical precision, his body performing the necessary tasks of survival, while his mind grappled with the significance of what had just transpired. The American had not taken the shot. Despite perfect positioning, despite clear line of sight, despite every tactical advantage, he had withheld his finger from the trigger, just as Min had done the night before. Why? The question echoed without answer. Professional courtesy between snipers? A momentary lapse in concentration? Or something deeper, a recognition of shared humanity that transcended the artificial boundaries of combat? Whatever the reason, it had altered the dynamic between them in ways that Lieutenant Thao and the other Viet Cong commanders would never understand. This was no longer simply predator and prey, hunter and hunted. It had become a dialogue conducted, through action and inaction, each choice a statement, each restraint a question. As Min made his way along the stream bank, searching for the crossing point that would allow him access to the western approach of the ridge, his thoughts returned to the dream that had haunted his sleep. His sister, whole and unbroken, asking if this endless cycle of violence and retribution was truly honoring their family's memory. He had no answer for her then. He had no answer for himself now. Only the growing certainty that adding one more death to the thousands that had already stained this land would accomplish nothing except the continuation of a cycle that had claimed too many lives already. Yet the mission remained. The American. Sniper was still his assigned target. Lieutenant Thao expected results, not philosophical crises. Duty and doubt warred within him as he moved through the underbrush, each step bringing him closer to the inevitable confrontation that would resolve. This strange, suspended moment between violence and understanding. Mid-morning found Mick moving down from his ridgeline position, abandoning the defensive advantage of elevation for the mobility required to bring this hunt to its conclusion. The decision might appear reckless to an outside observer, but it felt right. A necessary step in the unspoken negotiation that had begun with the Phantom's deliberate exposure in the clearing. The game had changed. They both knew it. Now it was a matter of determining what new rules would govern its conclusion. As Mick made his way down the rocky slope, rifle secured across his back to leave both hands free for the treacherous descent, his mind continued to grapple with the significance of his earlier hesitation. Why hadn't he taken the shot? It had been perfect. The kind of opportunity sniper teams waited days or weeks to find. Yet his finger had refused to apply the gentle pressure that would have ended the Phantom's life and completed his mission. The answer came not as a coherent thought but as a feeling, a sense that adding one more death to the thousands that had already stained this land would accomplish nothing except the continuation of a cycle that had claimed too many lives already. When had he begun to think of killing as futile rather than necessary? When had the clear, bright lines of duty and mission become so blurred? Mick couldn't pinpoint the exact moment of transformation, only its result. A growing uncertainty about his place in this war and the moral weight of his actions within it. He paused at a relatively flat section of the descent, taking a moment to check his bearings and adjust the field dressing on his arm. The wound was healing, but slowly, the flesh hot and tender beneath the bandage. Infection was a real possibility in this environment, where the very air seemed alive with microscopic threats. Just one more danger among many. As he prepared to continue his descent, a sound from below froze him in place. The unmistakable metallic click of a rifle safety being disengaged. His hand moved instinctively toward the sidearm at his hip, but a voice stopped him before he could draw. "I would not," the voice said in heavily accented but clear English. "We are both too good to miss at this range." Mick stood perfectly, still, his mind racing through options and finding none that ended well for both of them. The Phantom had the drop on him, a reversal of their earlier positions that carried its own ironic symmetry. "You had your shot this morning," Mick said, keeping his voice level despite the adrenaline surging through his system. "Why didn't you take it?" A pause, then. "I could ask you the same question, American." The standoff stretched between them, tense with possibility and danger. Mick could sense rather than see the Phantom's position, somewhere in the dense foliage, about 20 meters below, concealed but close enough for conversation. "Seemed like a waste," Mick finally answered, the honesty of the response surprising even himself. "Just one more death in a war that's seen too many already." Another pause, longer this time, filled with the ambient sounds of the jungle and the heavy rhythm of Mick's own breathing. "My name is Nguyen Minh," the voice said at last. "If you are to kill me, you should know who it is you kill." The introduction, so unexpected, so human, caught Mick off guard. Names changed everything. Names meant people, not targets. Names carried weight that ranks and positions did not. "Sergeant Michael Riley," he responded after a moment's hesitation. "My friends call me Mick." "We are not friends, Sergeant Riley." The statement held no hostility, only a flat acknowledgement of reality. "No," Mick agreed. "But we're not just enemies either, are we? Not anymore." A rustling from below suggested movement, but Mick resisted the urge to reach for his weapon. Something told him this conversation was more important than tactical advantage, more vital than the mission that had brought him to this ridge. "What are we then, American?" Min's voice carried a note of genuine curiosity beneath the tension. "What do you call two men who hunt each other through the jungle, who hold each other's lives in their hands yet choose not to end them?" Mick considered the question, searching for an answer that would encompass the strange, dangerous intimacy that had developed between them over days of stalking and counter-stalking. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I'm not sure there's a word for it. But I think we both know this ends one of two ways. Either we both walk away or neither of us does." The statement hung in the humid air between them, its implications expanding to fill the space like smoke. Walk away. Both alive. The very idea ran counter to everything Mick had been trained to do, everything his mission demanded. Yet somehow, in this moment, it felt like the only sane option in a world gone mad with killing. "Lieutenant Thao would not approve," Min said after a long silence, his tone suggesting the statement was more for himself than for Mick. "She believes every American death brings us closer to victory." "And what do you believe?" Mick asked, sensing vulnerability beneath the words, an opening in the armor of enemy that might lead to understanding. Another pause, filled with a weight that transcended language and culture. "I believe my sister would not recognize what I have become," Min finally said, his voice softer now, tinged with an emotion Mick recognized all too well. She was gentle, kind, even to the stray dogs that other children threw stones at. "Before your bombs fell, before—" He stopped abruptly, as if realizing he had said too much. Mick felt the impact of those words like a physical blow. Not the absent sister of a comfortable, distant family, but a victim of the very war they both served. Another casualty in an endless list that grew longer each day. "I'm sorry," he said, knowing the words were wholly inadequate but unable to find better ones. "For your sister, for all of it." A harsh laugh drifted up from below. "Sorry does not rebuild villages, American. Sorry does not bring back the dead." Yet despite the bitterness of the words, Min's tone lacked the expected heat of hatred. It carried instead the hollow resonance of loss that transcended any single tragedy to encompass the wider devastation of the war itself. "No," Mick agreed, "it doesn't." He hesitated, then added, "I have a son, back home. He was 3 when I left. Probably doesn't even remember what I look like now." The admission felt strange, dangerous, sharing personal details with an enemy sniper who still held him in his sights. Yet it also felt necessary, a step toward the humanity they both seemed to be reaching for through the smoke and chaos of war. "Why tell me this?" Min asked, genuine confusion evident in his voice. "Because I want to go home to him," Mick answered simply. "And I think maybe you want to go home too, whatever that means for you now. And I don't see how killing each other gets either of us any closer to that." The silence that followed was different from the earlier tense pauses, deeper, more contemplative, filled with the weight of decisions that could alter the course of 2 lives. "Perhaps," Min said finally, the single word carrying a universe of potential meaning. "But how does this end, American? We simply walk away, pretend we never met? Return to our respective sides and continue this war only against different enemies?" The questions cut to the heart of their shared dilemma. There were no good answers, no clean resolutions that wouldn't require betraying either duty or the fragile understanding that had begun to form between them. "I don't know," Mick admitted. "I just know I don't want to add your name to the list of men I've killed, and I'd prefer not to die in this godforsaken jungle either." A rustle of movement from below, then the crack of a rifle shot split the air, sending birds scattering from nearby trees. Mick instinctively dropped to a crouch, hand flying to his sidearm. But there was no pain, no impact of a bullet. Just the echoing report fading into the distance and the gradual return of jungle sounds as the wildlife settled back into its routine. "A miss?" Mick called after a tense moment of silence, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "Not a miss," Min's voice replied from much closer now, just beyond a screen of dense foliage to Mick's right. "A message for anyone watching, for ourselves." The implication was clear. A shot fired, a report to be made, a mission officially attempted, but no blood spilled, no life taken. A compromise between duty and the humanity they'd both begun to reclaim from the ashes of war. "What happens now?" Mick asked, slowly rising from his crouch, hands deliberately empty and visible. The foliage parted, and Nguyen Min stepped into view at last. He was smaller than Mick had imagined, his frame lean to the point of gauntness. But his eyes held a depth of experience that matched Mick's own, the 1,000-yard stare of men who had seen too much death to remain untouched by its passage. "Now we both disappear," Min said, his rifle held across his body, pointed at the ground rather than at Mick. "You to your side, me to mine. We report near misses, failed opportunities. The hunt continues, but elsewhere. With different hunters, different prey." It was a solution that satisfied neither duty nor honor completely, yet preserved something more important: the recognition of humanity that both men had nearly lost in the grinding machinery of war. "And if we meet again?" Mick asked, the question unnecessary yet demanding voice. The ghost of a smile touched Min's lips, transforming his face from the feared phantom of intelligence briefings to simply a man, tired and worn by war but still, improbably, capable of humor. "Then perhaps we share rice wine instead of bullets, American, in a different world than this one." The absurdity of the image, 2 snipers, enemies by every definition, sharing drinks like old friends, should have been laughable. Instead, it carried a poignant weight, a glimpse of a future beyond the immediate horizon of violence and death that had defined their existence for too long. "I'd like that," Mick said, surprising himself with the sincerity of the statement. Min nodded once, a gesture containing both acknowledgement and farewell. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared back into the jungle, leaving Mick alone with the weight of choices made and unmade, of a mission both failed and transcended. As Mick began his own descent toward the rendezvous point where Doc would be waiting, he felt something shift within him, not the triumphant relief of a completed mission, but something more complex, more human. A recognition that even in the darkest corners of war, choices remained. Humanity persisted if one had the courage to reach for it. 23 confirmed. The number would not change today. And somehow, that felt like the greatest victory of all. Mick moved carefully through the dense undergrowth, each step placed with deliberate precision despite the fatigue that weighed on him like a physical burden. The rendezvous point where Doc would be waiting was still several hours away, a journey complicated by terrain that seemed determined to claim every ounce of remaining strength he possessed. The encounter with Min, the Phantom no longer but a man with a name, a history, a humanity that could not be denied, had left Mick in a state of strange, suspended emotion, not the clean relief of mission accomplishment, nor the sharp focus of continued danger, but something more complex. A liminal space between duty and conscience where nothing was certain, except the weight of choices made and yet to be made. He paused at the edge of a small clearing, scanning the area with professional caution before proceeding. The habit was too deeply ingrained to abandon even now, when he believed the immediate threat had passed. Trust went only so far in a war zone, and the jungle held dangers beyond a single sniper. As he prepared to cross the open ground, a sound froze him in place, the unmistakable metallic click of a rifle being readied. Not from behind, where Min had disappeared, but from ahead, where the path led toward the rendezvous point. Not Min, someone else. The realization came with a cold rush of adrenaline that cut through his exhaustion like a blade. He dropped to a crouch, M40 swinging up into firing position with practiced fluidity, eyes scanning for any movement, any shadow that didn't belong. Nothing, just trees and vines and the constant maddening buzz of insects that had become the soundtrack to this nightmare pursuit. But the sound had been real. Mick was certain of it. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. The trap was sprung. A shot rang out, the bullet passing close enough to his head that Mick felt the displacement of air against his cheek. He dove for cover behind the massive root system of a banyan tree, mind racing through tactical assessments even as his body responded with trained precision. The shot had come from the east, not the direction he'd been facing, but from his flank. A classic ambush position, professional, calculating, but not Min. The angle was wrong, the approach too direct for the subtle hunter Mick had come to know through days of deadly chess. "You disappoint me, Comrade Min," a female voice called, out in Vietnamese accented English. "I expected better from the Phantom." Mick's blood ran cold. He recognized the tactical situation immediately. He was caught between two Viet Cong positions, one ahead and one to his flank. The odds of surviving such an ambush, especially in his exhausted state, were vanishingly small. "Lieutenant Thao sends her regards, American," the voice continued, closer now. She suspected Min's resolve might waver when it came to the final moment. Sentiment is a weakness she does not tolerate in her operatives. The implication was clear. Min's superiors had been watching their dance all along, waiting to see if the Phantom would complete his mission. When he hadn't, when he'd chosen words over bullets, they'd stepped in to finish what he'd started. Mick's mind raced through options, each more desperate than the last. The clearing offered no cover for movement. The dense jungle to his rear would slow him down, make him an easy target. Returning fire might buy time, but without knowing exact positions, he'd be shooting blind. "Your reputation precedes you, Sergeant Riley," the voice said, the formal address carrying a mocking edge. 23 confirmed kills, an impressive record. Lieutenant Thao will be pleased to add such a notable name to our own tally. "They know who I am. They've been tracking this mission from the beginning." The realization brought with it a wave of cold fury. How many men had died because of intelligence leaks? How many missions compromised? How many lives lost because someone somewhere had talked when they shouldn't have? Questions without answers, and no time to dwell on them now. Survival demanded focus, action, a calculated risk that might offer the slimmest chance of escape. Mick took a deep breath, steadying himself for what came next. One burst of covering fire toward the voice's source, then a sprint for the denser cover to the west. Not ideal, but better than waiting for the noose to tighten completely. His finger had just begun to apply pressure to the trigger when another shot rang out, not directed at him this time, but at something beyond his position. A cry of pain followed, distinctly human, distinctly surprised. Then Min's voice, calm but commanding. "Drop your weapon, Tran. You are outflanked." Confusion flooded Mick's mind, followed quickly by understanding. Min hadn't abandoned him, after all. He'd circled back, perhaps sensing the trap that his own people had laid. The standoff stretched for several heartbeats, tense with potential violence. Then the sound of a rifle being cast aside, followed by bitter Vietnamese that Mick couldn't understand but whose tone translated clearly enough. Defiance, anger, perhaps fear. "It is safe to emerge, American," Min called, "but I suggest you do so carefully. Tran is not alone, and others may be nearby." Mick hesitated, instinct warring with the fragile trust that had begun to form between himself and the man who had been, until very recently, his sworn enemy. The situation made no tactical sense. Why would Min turn against his own people to save an American sniper? Yet there was no time for extended analysis. If other Viet Cong forces were indeed in the area, every moment spent deliberating was a moment closer to discovery and death. Decision made, Mick rose from cover, rifle held at the ready but not aimed directly at either Vietnamese figure that came into view. Min stood with his own weapon trained on a younger man, barely more than a boy, really, who knelt on the jungle floor, one hand pressed to a bleeding shoulder, his face a mask of pain and fury. "You betray our cause for this American dog?" The boy, Tran, spat in heavily accented English, clearly intending Mick to understand the accusation. "Lieutenant Thao was right. You have lost your way, Phantom." Min's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes at the accusation. Not guilt, exactly, but a complexity of emotion that suggested the decision to intervene had come at no small cost. "The cause is not served by unnecessary death," Min replied calmly. "The war will end when enough of us choose to stop killing, not when every enemy is dead." Tran's face contorted with disgust. The words of a coward, a traitor. "When Lieutenant Thao hears of this—" "She will hear nothing from you today," Min interrupted, his tone hardening. "Go, Tran. Take your wounded pride and your simplistic hatred back to camp. Tell the lieutenant what you wish. It changes nothing." The dismissal carried an authority that seemed to deflate the young man despite his continued glare of defiance. With a final muttered curse, he rose unsteadily to his feet and backed away, disappearing into the jungle without retrieving his discarded rifle. Mick watched him go, then turned to Min with a question in his eyes. "He will not return," Min said in answer to the unspoken query. "Not alone. But others will come once he reports what has happened here. We should not linger." "Why?" Mick asked, the single word encompassing a universe of confusion and gratitude. "Why save my life at the cost of your standing with your own people?" Min was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the spot where Tran had disappeared. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of certainty that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the immediate chaos of war. "Because perhaps my sister was right. Perhaps I have become what I hate." He looked directly at Mick then, his eyes reflecting a resolve that had nothing to do with killing and everything to do with its opposite. It must end somewhere, this cycle. Someone must be the first to lower their rifle. The simplicity of the statement belied its profound implication. In a war defined by ideological absolutes, by the dehumanization of the enemy, by the relentless arithmetic of body counts and strategic objectives, Min had chosen to see beyond category to individual, beyond enemy to human being. It was a choice. Mick understood all too well, having made it himself just hours earlier. The recognition of shared humanity that transcended the artificial boundaries of combat, that challenged the very foundation upon which war itself was constructed. "They'll hunt you now," Mick said, the tactical reality reasserting itself despite the philosophical weight of the moment. "Your own people. For helping me." Min nodded, the gesture containing neither regret nor fear, only acceptance. "Yes, and yours would do the same to you, if they knew you had let the phantom live. We are both traitors now, in the eyes of those who see only in black and white." The truth of the statement hung between them, unavoidable in its clarity. Two men, caught between duty and conscience, between the institutional demands of war and the personal recognition of its futility. "What now?" Mick asked, the question encompassing far more than their immediate tactical situation. Min considered for a moment, then nodded toward the western path. "Your rendezvous point is that way, yes? Your spotter will be waiting. You should go, quickly. I will ensure no one follows." The offer was generous, tactically sound, and completely inadequate to the moment they found themselves in. Mick shook his head slowly. "And leave you to face Lieutenant Thau's people alone? That's suicide." A ghost of a smile touched Min's lips, transforming his face from the feared phantom of intelligence briefings to simply a man, tired and worn by war, but still, improbably, capable of humor. "I am the Phantom American. I disappear. It is what I do." The smile faded, replaced by a more somber expression. "Besides, this land is my home. I know its secrets in ways your maps can never capture. I will survive." Mick wanted to believe him, wanted to accept the assurance and the clean resolution it offered, each man returning to his own side, changed by their encounter but alive to carry that change forward. But the tactical reality remained. Min had made himself a target by intervening. His own people would hunt him with the same determination they showed toward American forces. Perhaps more, given the perceived betrayal. The decision formed not through conscious deliberation, but through the same instinctive recognition of shared humanity that had stayed Mick's finger on the trigger earlier. "Come with me," he said, the words emerging with a certainty that surprised even himself. "Back to my lines. We can get you out, maybe to Saigon or beyond. Somewhere Thao and her people can't reach you." Min's expression registered genuine shock, the first time Mick had seen his professional composure truly broken. "You suggest I defect? Become a tool for your CIA, a propaganda victory for your generals?" "I suggest you live," Mick countered, unwilling to retreat from the lifeline he'd offered. "The war's changing. Your side, my side, the lines are blurring. More and more people on both sides questioning what we're really fighting for. Maybe you can be part of that change, instead of another casualty of the old way of thinking." Min studied him intently, searching for signs of deception or manipulation. Finding none, his posture shifted slightly. Not quite relaxing, but losing some of the coiled tension that had characterized his bearing throughout their encounter. "And if I refuse? If I choose to take my chances in the jungle I know rather, than place my fate in the hands of those who have bombed my country for years?" The question was fair, the skepticism entirely justified. Mick considered his answer carefully, understanding that whatever fragile trust had formed between them hung in the balance. "Then we part ways here," he said finally. "You go your path, I go mine. And we both hope that if we ever cross paths again, it's in that better world you mentioned, the one where we share rice wine instead of bullets." The reference to their earlier conversation seemed to resonate with Min. Some of the wariness left his expression, replaced by a considering look that weighed possibilities against probabilities. "Your people would accept this? A Viet Cong sniper, walking into their camp under protection of one of their own?" Mick grimaced slightly. "I won't lie to you. It won't be easy. There will be interrogations, debriefings, suspicion from both sides. But there are channels, procedures for defectors, and having an American vouching for you will help. Left unspoken was the reality that Mick himself would face questions, possibly disciplinary action, for failing to eliminate a high-value target when the opportunity presented itself, for choosing to bring in an enemy combatant rather than complete his mission as ordered. But those were concerns for later, consequences to be faced once the immediate situation was resolved. One step at a time. Min was silent for a long moment, his internal debate visible only in the subtle shifts of his expression. Doubt, calculation, and finally, a decision reached through paths Mick could not follow. "I will consider your offer," he said at last. The words careful, measured. "But not today. Today we both must leave this place quickly before Tran returns with reinforcements. You to your rendezvous, me to—" He hesitated, then finished simply, "elsewhere." The decision was both disappointment and relief. Mick had meant his offer sincerely, yet the complications it would have introduced, for both of them, were significant. This way at least left options open, paths not irrevocably chosen. "Fair enough," Mick acknowledged. "But the offer stands. If you change your mind, head for the American firebase at coordinates Delta 9 3. Ask for Doc Sutherland. Tell him Mick sent you." He managed a tight smile. "He'll think I've lost my mind, but he'll listen." Min nodded once, the gesture containing both acknowledgement and a farewell that felt more final than either man wanted to voice. Then, with a fluid motion that spoke of years moving through jungle terrain, he retrieved his rifle and prepared to disappear once more into the shadows that had earned him his name. Before he vanished, however, he turned back to Mick with an expression that had shed its professional detachment, revealing instead a simple, human connection that transcended the barriers of language, culture, and opposing sides. "In another life, American," he said softly. "We might have been friends." Mick nodded, feeling the weight of those words and the worlds of possibility they contained. "In another life," he agreed. Then Min was gone, melting into the jungle with such perfect harmony that even Mick, trained to detect the subtlest signs of human passage, could not track his departure. For a long moment Mick stood motionless, absorbing the significance of what had transpired. Two enemies face to face, each with the power to end the other's life with the gentle pressure of a finger on a trigger, and each choosing, against all training and expectation, to stay that finger, to recognize in the other a humanity that demanded acknowledgement, respect, even protection. It was not peace, not reconciliation in any meaningful sense. The war continued around them, indifferent to their individual choices, grinding on with its own terrible momentum. Tomorrow or the next day or the day after that, Mick might find himself once again in the scope of an enemy sniper, one who had not made the same choice as Min, and Min himself faced dangers from both sides now. A man without a country in a conflict that recognized no neutral ground. Yet something had changed, something fundamental and irreversible. In choosing not to kill when killing was expected, demanded, justified by every measure of military necessity, both men had reclaimed a piece of their humanity from the machinery of war, had asserted, in the most personal and profound way possible, that even in the darkest corner of human experience, choice remained. Compassion persisted, dignity endured. It was not victory, not in any sense that would appear in dispatches or be tallied in the ledgers of war. But as Mick turned toward the rendezvous point where Doc waited, he felt something like peace settle within him, fragile, incomplete, but real nonetheless. 23 confirmed. The number would not change today. And in that unchanging tally, Mick found a quiet affirmation that, even in a war that demanded the surrender of so much, some things remained inviolate. Some choices, once made, defined. A man more truly than all the institutional demands of duty and mission combined. As he made his way through the jungle, rifle held ready but with no expectation of using it, Mick allowed himself to imagine that somewhere, in a future beyond the immediate horizon of violence and death, there might indeed be a world where two former enemies could meet as friends, could speak of these dark days from the perspective of survival rather than continued enmity. could share rice wine and stories and the simple, profound recognition that what unites us as human beings will always eventually prove stronger than what divides us. It was a hope worth holding on to, worth fighting for in a different way than he had fought before. And as the jungle canopy broke intermittently overhead, allowing glimpses of blue sky beyond the green hell that had been his world for too long, Mick embraced that hope with a fierceness that surprised him. One step at a time, one choice at a time, one reluctant trigger finger at a time. Perhaps that was how wars truly ended. Not with grand treaties or political settlements, but with individual soldiers deciding one by one that enough was enough. That the cycle of violence could not be broken by more violence, only by the courage to lower one's weapon first. It was not a solution that would satisfy generals or politicians, but it was the only one that offered any hope of genuine peace, any chance of returning to families and homes with souls intact enough to appreciate what waited there. As Mick approached the rendezvous point, he touched the empty breast pocket, where Angela's photograph had been, now safe with Doc, waiting to be reclaimed. The gesture felt like a promise, both to her and to himself. A vow to return not just physically but wholly, to bring home not just his body, but his humanity as well. That perhaps was the greatest victory possible in war, not the defeat of an enemy, but the preservation of what made peace worth having in the first place. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, it would mean a lot.